Economic modelers say that by 2050, Canada is going to need 2 or 3 times as much electricity as it currently produces, because we're going to be electrifying the economy. We're going to be drive electric cars, maybe heat and cool our house with electricity and so on. So where's that power going to come from? Well, that's a big question and we don't have any answers, but an emerging answer could be geothermal electricity, particularly in Western Canada. So I'm going to talk to Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon from the University of Calgary about that. Welcome to the interview, Sara.
Good to see you, Markham.
Well, look, let's start with kind of an overview. Where are we at in Western Canada with geothermal?
So we're in pretty early stages of really broad spread geothermal development. There's a few projects that have been proposed and some that are underway with construction. But, the industry is really in its infancy, where wind and solar were maybe a decade ago or more.
Yeah, it sounds like geothermal needs the kind of financial support that Germany provided in the 1990s and in the aughts, and then the U.S. picked up after that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there's a range of different things that have sort of prevented more development of geothermal, and funding and financing is one of the things that can help to move the needle on that. Geothermal, it is on a pure kilowatt hour basis or megawatt hour basis more expensive now than say wind and solar. That said, it brings a different kind of value to the grid because it is a dispatchable resource. So that means that the power underneath the ground is available 24/7 essentially, and can be used at different times. And so that higher cost does come with a higher value. But as you said, wind and solar were more expensive also when they started out. They got some direct funding to build out projects and bring the costs down. And there's also a bit of in Western Canada, there's been a little bit of a regulatory gap around having the kind of clear rules for the geothermal resource that are important. A project proponent that goes into a project development wants to understand, for example, what kind of royalties that they are going to be expected to pay. So unlike wind and solar, which are resources that are above the ground, the heat from geothermal comes from below the ground. And so, there's some questions about how royalty regimes apply there. And then finally, some work that I actually had done previously with a master's student and a postdoc looking at what has made geothermal development kind of challenging, because one would say on the face of it, there's a lot of overlap between the expertise that we have in Western Canada and the oil and gas industry. But what we found is that at the same time, the geothermal industry, competes with oil and gas for both equipment and people and resources. And so during boom times, in particular for oil, it's much harder to start up a geothermal industry because of the nature of that resource.
I want to pursue something you just mentioned, and that is that dispatchable power like geothermal has a higher value. And while that may be the case, valuing it is the problem. Alberta has really the only market-based system in Canada. Nevertheless, it doesn't have markets designed to value different types of electricity, wind and solar and hydro and coal, gas and so on at different values. It's basically on a kilowatt hour basis. You see the Americans in particular are beginning to grapple with this. They're coming up with different kinds of markets that they're experimenting with and beginning to implement. And so my question to you is, should this be something that Canada needs to grapple with, and particularly because we have a lot of government-owned utilities, like BC Hydro and Sask Power and Manitoba Hydro. And so how do we get, a market structure that values geothermal?
It's a good question. And so I would say, within Alberta, actually, the way that our market works is that there is an inherent value to power that is dispatchable, or power that is available at a time when it is most needed or most valued. And that's because the way that our competitive market works is that the price of power is set by the marginal producer. And so in times when power is more scarce compared to the demand, the prices are higher. And so if you have a resource that is either dispatchable in nature or happens to be producing at times when that power is scarce, that higher value is going to be reflected in the higher prices that it receives in the market. That said, I think one of the challenges when it comes to something like geothermal is that we can go a lot further than we have gone already in developing out wind and solar in Alberta before we really need to worry about the dispatchability. There's sort of, I've seen different numbers, but I think 50% is a pretty good rule of thumb, that with a combination of wind and solar, you could get to about 50% on an annual average renewable energy in Alberta without having much issues in the way of balancing that power. And so what that means is that until you get to that point, the value that the geothermal, for example, can bring through its dispatchability is not really reflected in the market. Now, you can say that that value is not reflected there because, frankly, it's not needed yet, right? You don't need that kind of dispatchability, but it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem where, especially if the pace of renewable energy development, which is now picking up in Alberta, but for many years was far below, and is probably still below what we need it to be ultimately, that until you get more and more of that wind and solar coming online, the economic case isn't there for the dispatchable geothermal power. And that's where I do think that there's a role for policymakers to step in and say, well, we know that this is something that we are going to need. And so we can start to provide some direct economic incentive, or even looking at, the type of programs that Alberta used for wind and solar development under the previous government, this renewable energy procurement program that basically guarantees a certain price. And then if the prices are higher, then the government and the public kind of gets that added benefit. Something like that can start incentivizing the development now, so that when we get to the point of needing it, we have those resources and they are ready.
Now, you've written in the past about the value to developing these kind of resources and new technologies of government investment. That even failures, we learn a lot from failures, and there's value to that. But government investment in the oil sands, for instance, it wouldn't be an oil sands if the federal and provincial government hadn't invested in it. And you think that investing in these early stage industries, it can provide a tremendous competitive advantage. And all. So it seems to me, based on your previous work, that geothermal would be a really good candidate for provincial governments, but particularly the federal government, to step in and provide some financial support.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then the question is, understanding where in the technology development stage geothermal is, and therefore what the right kind of government support is, right? So the earlier on, when you're really talking about piloting completely new technology, you need a lot more direct financial support. As you move up the technology readiness level and readiness curve, that's when you can start to move to these other kinds of, whether they're loan guarantees or contracts for difference, that are basically, providing some of that revenue certainty to a technology that is already somewhat more mature. I think geothermal, may be somewhere in the middle there. But I think it's also interesting to note that the US government is, kind of has almost like a renaissance, again, a big focus on geothermal as a key piece of that fully decarbonized grid. So again, a fully decarbonized grid is going to be most cost effective if we do it with a mix of, a lot of wind and solar, and then energy storage, dispatchable resources like geothermal, as well as transmission. And so I think there's wind and solar are solidly in the commercialized sphere now, and we see those projects, even in Alberta now being developed. I think it was just 2 or 3 days ago there was another wind project announcement, I think, with a corporate buyer. So that's moving ahead. But some of those other pieces, also transmission lines, frankly, but certainly geothermal, need a little bit more of that support to get going.
Now, we saw the federal government, we saw the Liberals during the election campaign. Now, of course, they're forming a minority government, but they promised a lot of support for modernization of the power grid, and they proposed the PanCanadian Grid Council. And it's getting geothermal connected to the grid will probably be a bit of a challenge. Do you think this is something that maybe could get taken up by the Grid Council, if it gets off the ground?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know to what extent. I mean, as I said, there's these different components that are needed, right? So the transmission lines that are connecting provinces to each other or to the states, and building out those connections. But certainly more geothermal on the project development side is an important component of it as well too. So I think it's, again, you're sort of looking at, it's an all of the above type solution. And I think sometimes that gets lost a little bit as well, that wind and solar and geothermal is almost sort of set up as a versus, we should do this one or this one, when it's really very much of an and story. They bring different things, they have different benefits in terms of the cost versus the value that they bring to the grid. And clearly, in order to reach in order to meet the growing demand for electricity that's going to come from electrification, and also meet the targets that we need to around decarbonizing the grid, we need to really be building out both, at a continued pace from now.
Well, Sara, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.